You're live now.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm now going to call the meeting to order. I'm Rob Mujica, State Budget Director, and the Governor has designated me as chair for today's meeting. I'm going to begin by introducing the three other ex officio members of the board: State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, the Mayor of the City of New York, Bill de Blasio, and Comptroller for the City of New York, Scott Stringer. I would like now to welcome to the board the three new members appointed by the Governor: Mr. Steve Cohen, former Secretary to the Governor; Ms. Rosanna Rosado, New York Secretary of State; Mr. William Bill Thompson, Chairman of the CUNY Board of Trustees and former New York City Comptroller, which also means that he is a former member of this board. I'd also like to thank the outgoing members of the Financial Control Board, Mr. John Levin and Mr. Lawrence Golub. On behalf of the Governor and the people of New York, thank you for your service to this board. I'd like to note the presence of the designated observers of today's meeting: Doreen and Sarah, observer for the Senate Majority Leader; Mark Rizal, observer for the City Council Minority Leader; and Matthew Harnish, observer for the Speaker of the New York State Assembly. I will now entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the last annual board meeting, which was held on August 7th, 2019. These minutes were previously distributed to the board members for comment. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move it.
Thank you. With that motion, all in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye. Aye.
The motion is passed. The minutes are approved. Before we begin today's business, I'd like to take a few moments to discuss the purpose of the board and the circumstances that led to its existence. I share this history both for the benefit of our new colleagues as well as the general public, many of whom may be viewing these proceedings for the first time. The board's roots reach back to 1975, when the markets refused to buy New York City debt and the city's public accounting masked the severity of the problem and still showed a year-end deficit in the billions. This is a history told and retold many times. The national economy was in a recession. Many New Yorkers were leaving the city at the time and were taking their tax dollars with them. Primarily, however, the impetus was that the credit markets discovered that the city had been creatively using different kinds of borrowing to balance its budgets, and it would not be able to repay any new debt. In short, the everyday services on which all New Yorkers relied on was being paid not only with current tax dollars, but with future tax dollars as well. In the throes of this crisis, it was noted by prominent observers that it was the misuse of borrowing that distinguished New York from other cities and was the fundamental cause of the city's crisis at the time. In June of 1975, with the city unable to market its debt and without cash, New York State created the Municipal Assistance Corporation, or MAC, to buy the city's debt and reissue the debt for the long term on its behalf. The MAC debt was backed by specific revenues that were paid directly to the corporation, not to the city. The law creating the MAC also required the city to adopt new accounting practices and new budgeting practices. By the fall of 1975, it had become clear that even more stringent reforms were needed to set the city on a sustainable path. The city announced actions such as many service reductions, layoffs, but many of them weren't actually implemented at the time. Federal aid, much like today, looked increasingly unlikely to materialize. And this was the moment that President Ford infamously suggested bankruptcy. Instead, state taxpayers bailed out the city, but not without state oversight. The Financial Emergency Act for the City of New York was enacted, which created this board. Chaired by the Governor, this board oversaw the city's finances by approving, disapproving, and modifying the city's budgets and certain union contracts. It was originally conceived as an emergency board, and it was anticipated to dissolve in 1978. But even with the FCB, credit markets remained closed to the city through that time. In 1978, the federal government, the state, and the city agreed to a plan to reinstate the city's access to credit markets through a combination of MAC bonds and federally backed city bonds. As a condition, the Emergency Financial Control Board would continue simply as the Financial Control Board, with the new MAC bonds containing a pledge that the board would continue until the bonds were repaid as condition one. Condition two, that the city had balanced its budget 3 years in a row according to generally accepted accounting principles. And three, that the state and city controllers certified the city had sufficient credit market access. It took until 1986 and resulting from the strong oversight actions of this board that these conditions were met. The board ordered hundreds of millions of dollars in budget cuts above those proposed by the administration, and it took many difficult labor-related actions, including layoffs and rejecting contracts. When the conditions were finally met, this body became a monitoring board. The city must continue to adhere to the same accounting and budgeting practices, but this board now meets only annually to determine whether 5 specific criteria were met in the city's most recent fiscal year, which would trigger a new control period. The ultimate authority to reimpose a control period now rests with the state legislature since 2008, 30 years after the Emergency Financial Control Board was originally anticipated to dissolve. But the responsibility to monitor the city's finances and report any adverse determination to the state legislature remains the responsibility of this board. Many hard decisions were made to rescue New York City from fiscal crisis of the 1970s. Sacrifices were shared among taxpayers, city workers, and the bondholders. The fiscal crisis for the city in 1975 was also a fiscal crisis for New York State. In October of that year, Governor Carey testified before Congress that the state cannot borrow funds because the credit market has closed its doors to our offerings, referring to the state. Those doors for the state closed in large part because of the investors' concerns with New York City's finances as well as the state's. 45 years later, the state of New York's official disclosure in all debt documents to investors still says, quote, "The fiscal demands of the state may be affected by the fiscal condition of New York City, which relies in part on state aid to balance its budget and meet its cash out requirements. It is also possible that the state's finances may be affected by the ability of New York City and its related insurers to market securities successfully in the public credit markets. Therefore, this board, by insisting on a responsible financial plan from city officials, is protecting not only the residents of this city, but also the entire state. In the 1970s, this board and city leaders for years resisted temptations to make the easy choices of the moment that would have exacerbated problems for the future. It is because of those hard decisions that the city was able to enjoy a fiscal health and enjoyed it for an extended and prolonged period. But today, as a result of the global pandemic, the city's financial position and the city itself faces perhaps its most severe crisis since 1975. The city now projects annual budget gaps of $3 to $4 billion through the duration of its financial plan. It may actually be worse than that, as there are billions of dollars worth of additional risk identified by the Financial Control Board staff and by some of the members of this board in their reviews of the city's financial plan. We'll have the opportunity to hear from those members momentarily. These risks are exacerbated by the fact that many of New York City's largest taxpayers have been spending more and more time outside of the city. Many of them left because of the pandemic, but they took tax revenue with them, and they may not be in a hurry to rush back. In addition, recent federal changes that cap the deduction for state and local taxes created an incentive for taxpayers that fund vital services to migrate from New York City. New York City faces these realities while already nursing a fragile economy. The Partnership for New York City recently estimated as many as 520,000 jobs were lost from the small business sector alone. These are difficult times indeed. Of course, restraint in the good years makes it much easier to navigate through the bad years. Through 2013, 2019, the longest expansion in this nation's histories, the city's expenditures have increased on an average of 5%. The city's workforce have grown just under from just under 225,000 to nearly 275,000, 7% increase. And this year's the property tax levy will be over $11.2 billion higher than it had been had the property tax that's in place for the rest of local governments been in place. This pattern has left the city and the state, and this board should be concerned, potentially burdened. The lessons from this body's histories have never been more important than they are today. And it's against this backdrop that the Financial Control Board convenes this August of 2020. So with that, I'd like to call on the mayor to present the city's four-year financial plan.
Thank you very much,
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I'm going to just do some brief formal remarks, but I'd like to begin with just a reflection on your opening. I think it's really valuable to recount the history. A lot of us grew up with that history, and we are deeply mindful of it. And it's in fact framed a lot of the decisions that we've made. So I'm always going to encourage people to know their history, but also a study of history teaches you what is the same and what is different. There's no question in the 1960s, 1970s, this city was not well managed fiscally. There's no question that we were declining economically on a foundational level and for structural reasons, not because of a global pandemic, for much deeper reasons. And I think we are all grateful for the actions taken in the 1970s by the state, by members of the private sector, labor, everyone working together. But I think it's very important to note the history as you discussed it, that the crucial year 1986, when those previous obligations were addressed and we started to move forward. And I give my colleague, predecessor mayors credit. I think one after another, people focused on fiscal discipline and making sure we did have the best and most advanced practices. And this city has been, I think, in so many ways, a great example of city government doing things the right way fiscally and being rewarded in the markets for that, including last year when our bond rating was upgraded by one of the agencies. There's a good history from the 1980s on of the city learning the lessons of the 60s and the 70s. But again, you think about that watershed year, 1986, that was fully 34 years ago. So I don't want us to overstate the parallel. We have huge challenges. No one's doubting it. But this city also laid in huge reserves. That's part of why we were able to move forward in this circumstance. We've made a lot of tough decisions on savings. We're going to make a lot more. We've made very clear that we're ready to take extensive actions and not easy or popular actions if needed. So I do appreciate the history, but as I think you'll see in my presentation, we have very deeply accounted for a number of these concerns. And I think it would just be a mistake to think this is anything like the New York City of the 60s or 70s or even 80s. We are today a tremendous global economic capital. And even though we've been obviously deeply thrown for a loop like so many other places, recently as February, we had 4.6 million jobs, the most we've had in our history. So I do appreciate the points you made, Mr. Chair, but I will also say I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about New York City's future because of just plain structural improvement that has happened over decades and decades. And I think we can all work together to keep deepening that. But now just turn quickly to the formal remarks. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, both for your role on this board, but we also, all our team works with you daily on so many matters. Thank you for your collegial work that we have done together. I want to thank all the members of the board, of course, both controllers, and I want to welcome Mr. Cohen and Secretary of State Rosado and a colleague I've known for a long time, Bill Thompson. We share a great first name. I just want to thank all of you and look forward to working with all of you as we work through this. So yes, this is where I want to pick up on one of the points the chair made. This is unquestionably the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. But nonetheless, we presented an on-time budget and a balanced budget, and a greatly reduced budget. On time in June for fiscal year 21, that budget is $88.2 billion. I want to thank all my colleagues, including two here, First Deputy Mayor Dean Fulihan and Budget Director Melanie Hartzog and their teams that made this happen. We worked very closely with the City Council in partnership to do that. So we understand that we have a tough road ahead, and we understand that there's uncertainty and the way back. I do believe that history teaches us there will always be a way back from New York City, certainly for New York State, but it will be gradual. Before, as I said, we couldn't have had a stronger economic situation in every sense. And the reason that we did increase that budget over time was because we had the revenue, and we did increase our public workforce because there was important work to be done. And I believe fundamentally that work built our economy further. The investments in public safety, investments in education, the investments in building our economic sector, particularly things like our new and growing tech sector over the last decade or two. Those investments were correct in my view, and as of February, no one would have doubted the strength of our economy. But we have work to do, and we are ready to do very bold things to address that which confronts us. We had built up extraordinary reserves, over $6 billion. We have drawn on those reserves, but we still remain focused on what allowed us to balance each and every budget. And that was obsessive focus on savings. We were doing that even when our revenue position was very strong. So we're constantly looking for savings and efficiencies in our agencies. One thing I give OMB a lot of credit for, the city OMB is constantly focusing also on responsible, conservative revenue estimates, and those have been holding. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we anticipate our tax revenue loss between fiscal 20 and fiscal 21 of $9 billion. We believe that figure is accurate at this time. Huge hit, but one we are addressing. At the time we presented the executive budget in April, that appeared to be a $7.4 billion loss, but it did increase by $1.6 billion by the time we got to June. Now, again, we want to believe the worst of the damage is over. We have seen some improvement of late. But on a human level, on the level of what New York City residents are experiencing, in March and April alone, 920,000 people lost their jobs, and some of our sectors were particularly hard hit. Hospitality, food services, there are some obvious areas that really took a hard hit that's going to take real time to bring back. But if you look at the June job data, we see some good news. No one's overstating it, but some good news. City recovering 14% of the jobs lost since April. And we are heartened by the fact that our recovery is moving. We moved through phases 1 through 4 on time, working closely with the state. Clearly, the healthcare situation in New York City over the last 2 months has been holding at a very positive level. And we do see more and more economic activity, more and more people riding mass transit, things that do give us hope. We understand that our job in this budget is to focus on health and safety first. So whatever tough choices we have to make, that will be our key focus. And that we have to maintain fiscal responsibility and a balanced budget no matter what. Now, clearly, every one of us is watching with great concern what's happening in Washington as we speak. We received $2 billion in earlier stimulus actions, but that's far from enough. We, the city, the state, citizens of the country all need a real stimulus, actual stimulus that lives up to the word stimulus, not just makeshift, not just something hand to mouth, but something that helps us move forward. I know Governor Cuomo feels this deeply. I know he's been fighting for it intensely. We do not know what's going to happen these next few days, especially because we're unclear about what will happen with stimulus. I reiterate why it is so important for the state legislature and the governor to grant us long-term borrowing authority. We can determine together the level that makes sense. We are only interested in the amount of borrowing necessary to help us keep going as a city as we build back. The great parallel, 2001, after the horrible attack on this city, legislature unanimously determined to give New York City $2.5 billion in borrowing authority. No strings attached. Absolutely a collegial act, and that act was respected by the city. I give my predecessors, Mayors Giuliani and Bloomberg, credit. That money was handled very responsibly and carefully. $2 billion was borrowed. It has been repaid. We think there's good precedent there. for just figuring out what it needs, what we need to do what I think we all agree would be common sense, to avoid large-scale layoffs in the city. I've been very clear that if we do not get support from Washington or Albany, we are prepared, I am prepared, to move forward layoffs that could amount to the loss of 22,000 city employees. There's no one in this meeting who wants to see that happen. Horrible for the folks who have worked so hard to get us through this pandemic, horrible for their families, horrible for our economy. It should not happen. It does not need to happen. But if we have no other choice, if Washington won't help us, if there is not appropriate borrowing authority from Albany, if we cannot come to appropriate plans with the labor community, that's what we would do. I truly want to believe, Mr. Chair, that any and all of those solutions are readily available. We've had very productive talks with the labor community, very serious talks over weeks and weeks. I'm going to take the optimistic view that we're going to find our way forward together. But nonetheless, with all these challenges, again, we did balance our budget. In that process, we focused on health and safety. In that focus, we focused on in that process, we focused on communities hardest hit by the coronavirus, communities of color that experienced tremendous disparities. We focused on police reform. We achieved a lot working with the city council. We moved $1 billion between expense and capital funds, $1 billion plus, I should say, into youth programs, into community needs, while keeping a focus on the patrol strength we need to keep the city safe. We invested in young people and helping them through this extraordinarily difficult time. We invested in public housing and recreation opportunities, community centers and public housing. These are things that are going to help us get through this crisis in terms of healthcare, in terms of safety. But we did that by moving money appropriately from one agency to another, not by adding. So the key going forward, and I'll conclude in just a moment, is to focus on savings and efficiencies. This is something we've been doing constantly. Excuse me. And over the last 2 years, $6 billion in savings programs achieved. Big focus in particular on healthcare savings, and I think we all agree this is an area where all governments need to focus. We've worked cooperatively with the labor community to achieve major healthcare savings. But what I think we have to focus on going forward, besides the most obvious, which is balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility, is we've got to focus on the health of New Yorkers, the safety of New Yorkers, keeping a roof over their head and keeping food on their table. We are down to the basics right now. And we will not in any way skimp when it comes to saving lives. We had to add a huge amount of medical personnel during the crisis. Those were the right investments to make. We've had to provide food, now over 100 million meals for free to New Yorkers in need. That was the right investment to make. We had to get medical equipment and PPEs. That was the right investment to make. And thank God, years earlier, we made an investment, to the point, Mr. Chairman, about why the growth of the budget in the good years made sense. We invested in our Health and Hospitals Corporation, 11 hospitals, 70 clinics. Because we stabilized the budget of the Health and Hospitals Corporation, made it stronger, allowed it to modernize and greatly improve its capacity, we were able to bear the brunt of the coronavirus crisis as the epicenter of the nation. And I assure you, those health and hospitals facilities were amongst the very hardest hit in New York City, representing those communities of color that suffered so much. And those hospitals held because of the investments that have been made. We are also going to spare no expense when it comes to test and trace, something we've been working on very productively with the state, to build the ability constantly to have all the test and trace capacity needed to contain this disease. Today, I was happy to report to people in New York City only a 1% infection rate. We're testing people at a higher level than ever since this crisis began. Capacity to now test up to 50,000 New Yorkers a day, but we are consistently getting a 1% or 2% rate each day. That's a very favorable sign for our future. We have invested in testing and in the test and trace follow-up to keep the infection level low, and it clearly is working. We've been at that level of under 3% infection level for now fully 2 months. We are committed to keeping a roof over people's head. We're doing all we can with landlord-tenant mediation, with legal services to keep people from losing their homes. We are committed to keeping small businesses alive, to get through to next year when, thank God, we do believe there will be a vaccine and a turning of the page. grants, loans, and a whole host of other forms of support for small business. We are committed to helping the most vulnerable New Yorkers, protecting those who happen to be homeless and making sure they're in safe facilities. And I wish we did not have the hunger problem we face, but we do, and it's profound. And I've made a clear commitment to all New Yorkers. No New Yorker will go hungry. Any family that needs food, it will be available free. And that's one of the things that's helping the city to fight through this crisis and begin to see some of the comeback we now are experiencing. So to conclude, we are committed to these principles. We are convinced that we can achieve these imperatives: keeping people safe, keeping them healthy, keeping them fed, keeping them housed, no matter what is thrown at us. If we get federal support, it will be immeasurably more straightforward and easier. If we get support from the state to help us bridge, it will be much easier. If we get cooperation from our labor community, which we do expect, it will be much easier. But whatever is thrown at us, I will make the decisions necessary to keep a balanced budget. And this city will weather the storm. We weathered the Great Depression and World War II. We weathered all the economic decline and loss of population in the 60s and 70s. We weathered the Great Recession. We weathered 9/11. We weathered Hurricane Sandy, our worst natural disaster in our history. New York City always comes back. So the history you raised, Mr. Chair, again, appreciated and in so many ways important to reflect on. But I want to add the most important coda, most important exclamation point. New York City always comes back, and always comes back stronger, and it will happen again. So I thank you for this opportunity to work together to see that day come to fruition. I can't hear anyone. Can you all hear?
There we go. Now we go. You unmute there. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We agree, right? The city is in much better fiscal condition than it was in 1975. I wanted to highlight the history of the board just so we can understand that why the board was established. But the city's in much more better fiscal conditions, better reporting than it was in 1975. But the fiscal challenges both the state and the city face are we haven't seen since that time, if not before that. And we both are going to have similar challenges going forward. And that's the mission of the board. New York State and New York City's finances are inextricably linked, and they will be going forward, as goes New York City, goes the rest of the state. But I believe we can all work together to achieve what we both want to achieve and what this board needs to achieve for New Yorkers. So I thank you for your comments and your review of the financial plan. With that, I'm going to go to the State Comptroller, Tom DiNapoli. Do you have any comments on the New York City's financial plan?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And thank you, Mayor de Blasio, for your report to the board and also your very thoughtful commentary on what your programmatic priorities are. We always have to keep in mind budget numbers are one thing, but what are the programmatic priorities behind that? So thank you for sharing that. I'd like to offer some brief observations on behalf of the Office of the State Comptroller. These are based on our review of the city's financial plan that we released earlier this week. In January, the city projected balanced budgets for fiscal years 2020 and 2021 and modest out-year budget gaps on the assumption of continued economic growth. Just a few months later, the nation entered a recession and the city faced its greatest challenge in decades, as we all recognize. The social, economic, and budgetary impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have been unprecedented. Social distancing and restrictions on non-essential businesses helped slow the spread of the disease, but also sharply reduced economic activity. More than 940,000 jobs were lost in March and April, the largest job loss since the Great Depression. The loss represented 1/5 of the jobs in the city and erased nearly all of the job gains of the past 10 years. The unemployment rate, which had fallen to a record low of 3.4% in February 2020, shot up to 20.4% in June, the highest level in 44 years. While the city regained 121,800 jobs in May and June, it may take years for the city to fully recover. The budgetary impact has also been costly. The city currently projects a two-year revenue loss of $9.6 billion for fiscal years 2020 and 2021. To offset the revenue loss and address its other needs, the city freed up $11.4 billion in resources, but many of those resources were non-recurring. Nearly $4.1 billion came from reserves, including $2.6 billion from the Retiree Health Benefits Trust. The trust was created to fund future post-employment benefits other than pensions. The city should commit to replenish the trust when conditions permit. The city also reduced the general reserve for 2021 from $1 billion to $100 million, the statutory minimum for the start of the fiscal year. As of now, federal aid will provide $1.9 billion in budget relief, but those resources are also non-recurring. While the citywide savings program has a value of $3.3 billion in 2021, the recurring value falls to about $1.7 billion annually. Also of concern is the growth in city-funded debt service, which is projected to reach $9 billion in 2024, an increase of 44% in just 5 years. Debt service as a share of tax revenue would reach 13.5%, below the city's self-imposed ceiling of 15%, but close to the peak reached during the Great Recession. Despite a balanced budget in the current fiscal year, the city projects a budget gap of $4.2 billion next year because it relied on non-recurring resources to balance this year's budget. The city has managed gaps of this magnitude in the past, but there are risks that could greatly increase the size of the projected budget gap. My office has quantified risks of $1.8 billion in the current fiscal year and more than $2.3 billion in subsequent years, which could increase next year's budget gap to $6.5 billion. The largest risk is the expectation, yet to be realized, of $1 billion in recurring labor savings. The city's financial plan also assumes that any wage increases in the first 2 years of the next round of collective bargaining will be funded with savings from productivity improvements. Another risk is the reduction in the budget for police overtime by $350 million in fiscal year 2021. It also remains to be seen whether the city's revenue forecasts are sufficiently conservative. While the city recently entered phase 4 of the state's 4-phase plan to reopen the economy, some activities are still not permitted and others are limited. The pace of the recovery will also depend on the severity of a potential second wave, the availability of a vaccine or effective treatments, and long-term changes in social and business practices. In addition, the city's 4-year financial plan does not fully reflect the impact of the enacted state budget. For example, while the city funded a $360 million shortfall in anticipated state education aid in the current fiscal year, it made no provision in subsequent years. Moreover, as the governor has indicated, it is very possible there will be a large cut in aid to localities that will be needed to close a $13.3 billion gap in the state's budget without additional federal aid. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which is critically important to the city's recovery, faces an unprecedented financial crisis of its own with a $9 billion budget gap over this year and next. New York City, New York State, and the MTA all need additional federal aid to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their budgets. The three are closely intertwined, and failure to aid one could adversely affect the others. Congress is debating the size and content of another COVID-19 relief bill. The outcome is uncertain. Certainly, as the mayor said, Governor Cuomo has been forthright in explaining the need for this, not just for New York, but for other states, not just for New York City, but for localities all across our state and our nation. We all must join with his voice to call for action with more federal support. Given the risks facing the city's budget and its diminished reserves, this office strongly recommends that the city prepare additional gap closing actions to ensure budget balance in the current fiscal year and to close next year's budget gap. So in wrapping up, I certainly want to commend Mayor de Blasio and his team for extraordinary efforts during extraordinary times. My counterpart, City Controller Scott Stringer, for his important role in these discussions, the City Council as well, and all of your respective staffs. As Chairman Mojica said, we're all in this together. We all have to work together to get to a better place, certainly for New York City, for our state as well. As always, we appreciate Jeff and the team at the Financial Control Board. And I just want to close by mentioning my appreciation to Ken Bleiweiss, who prepares our reports, Deputy Controller for New York City, 4 decades working in the State Controller's Office, the past 18 or so as deputy. He's retiring in about 2 weeks. So Ken, thank you for everything that you've done. And we are not wasting any time. We have someone to backfill Ken's important role. Rahul Jain, who you're all going to get to know, is the new Deputy Controller for the Office of State Controller for New York City. And Rahul is certainly prepared to work with all stakeholders to get us through this difficult time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You have to unmute.
Okay. Try it again. Thank you, Controller DiNapoli. City Controller Stringer, would you like to comment on the city's financial plan? There we go. You're off mute.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody for giving me this opportunity. And I want to begin by acknowledging Mayor de Blasio, Controller DiNapoli, and State Budget Director Mojica. I also want to welcome the newest members of the Financial Control Board, Secretary of State Rosado, Steve Cohen, and my esteemed predecessor, Bill Thompson, or number 42, as I like to call him, the 42nd Controller of New York City. We meet this year under extraordinary circumstances. Without question, the single most fiscally stressful year since this board was created in 1975. In March, driven above all by the goal of protecting public health, the state and the city rightly issued stay-at-home orders and closed all non-essential businesses. In the space of just a few months, the unemployment rate went from a historic low of 3.4% to an historic high of 20.4%. Among young people, the unemployment rate skyrocketed to 35%. 1 out of every 4 workers of color is now unemployed in New York City. Just as quickly, city revenues slumped as well. Revenues in the 2021 adopted budget are $7 billion below the mayor's preliminary budget forecast, a decline of 10%. In the ensuing months, the city acted to deal with the growing budget gap for 2021. The 2 main pillars of the city's approach were to draw down its reserves and to implement a citywide savings plan. The savings plan generated $2.8 billion to close the gap. And while this sounds impressive, over half of the savings consists of one-time actions, including school closures, cancellation of youth programming, and other actions attributed to COVID-19. Reoccurring savings equal less than 3% of agency spending in the out years of this plan. And the city used $4 billion in reserves to balance FY 2021, including $2.6 billion from the Retiree Health Benefit Trust. Next year's gap is at least $4.2 billion, equal to almost 11% of agency city fund spending. We have relied too heavily on reserves, on one-time savings, and on risky assumptions. We have relied too heavily on the notion that we have an adequate savings plan when the reality is this administration failed to save in the good times. We have the lowest savings in decades. We must also recognize that the biggest single one-time savings in this budget is from cutting the police overtime budget to $227 million, nearly 70% less than fiscal year's 2020 spending. This must be counted as one of the most significant risks to the city spending plan. Likewise, the $1 billion in unspecified labor savings, on top of no raises for 2 years, are placeholders, not a strategy. In the coming days, we will know the contours of the next federal stimulus. The amount and conditions of that aid will be critical in determining how we move forward. Now, the governor has warned of the potential for cuts in local aid as much as 20%. That's the equivalent of more than $3 billion for the city, including $2 billion in aid in our schools. If all of this causes you concern, it should. Now we must confront an even harder challenge. The second budget year in a recession is always harder than the first. We face a significant budget gap next year, and the current plan simply has not done enough to address these fundamental questions. The gap is significant, but it's not insurmountable. But it is impossible to overstate the importance of acting right away to begin reducing next year's gap. Now, some say we must ask marginalized communities in our city to accept cuts to vital government services in order to close the gap. They say that any other way will drive out wealthier taxpayers from the city. I reject the false choice. I reject the idea that those who have suffered the most should be asked to suffer even more. My mom died of COVID-19 related complications in a hospital in the Bronx. When I spoke to the doctor after her passing, I did say that I understood how difficult it must be to lose grandparents and parents taken away by this virus. The doctor corrected me real fast. In the Bronx, he said, we saw the highest rates of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. We lost young people and people who had pre-existing conditions. These are the people in communities that have borne the brunt of disinvestment for decades, resulting in inequities in education, jobs, and health outcomes. This has left an entire generation vulnerable and in harm's way. Our first instinct should not be to cut summer youth jobs when young people are facing a 35% unemployment rate. Our first instinct should not be threatening to cut programs for students and to say to frontline workers that your jobs are on the line. Instead, rather than threaten vulnerable people, the city must undertake a serious agency by agency savings program that looks to root out the countless small examples of waste, inefficiency, and outdated programs in the nooks and crannies of city government. This used to be a regular practice of city government, and it should be again. And we should ask the wealthiest among us to stand in solidarity with the rest of our city and contribute a little bit more to our recovery. Finally, I want to recognize that we may be eventually at a point where borrowing to cover operating expenses should be on the table. As city controller, I will insist on knowing exactly why we are borrowing and for what purpose, and how it will be a bridge to a sustainable budget in the long run before I authorize any borrowing plan. The attempt to borrow money months ago was about simply holding on to money with no visible economic plan. That is not what should happen. We all have to work together, city and state, to come up with a plan that's forward thinking, because after all, this is not our money. This is the money of our children. The debt service on borrowed money will actually be paid not by us, but for future generations. So we owe it to the next generation to get this right. And I stand ready to work with the mayor and all of you to think and strategize about a real economic plan that meets our challenges. We have confronted, as it's been pointed out, our share of challenges in the past, from the fiscal crisis of the 70s to 9/11 and the Great Recession. Each time we've been forthright about the challenges, we've seized opportunities, and we've made sacrifices where we had to. We can and we will do it again. I look forward to working with all of you. As our predecessors did in the 1970s, we must work together to make real choices through an open dialogue. We must not only balance our budget, but we must imagine a new social compact that treats all New Yorkers today and tomorrow with dignity and respect. We cannot reopen our economy the way we closed it. We have an opportunity to change the direction of our city once and for all. And it's going to take fortitude, control, but also a certain passion for the city we all love. I thank you for giving me this opportunity and working with all of you.
Thank you, Controller Stringer. We're also very sorry for your loss as a result of this pandemic. I'd like now to call on Jeff Summer, our acting executive director to present the staff's comments on New York City's four-year financial plan. Mr. Sommer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In April, with the submission of the fiscal 2021 executive budget, the city made its first attempt to deal with the economic repercussions as the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has claimed thousands of lives, overwhelmed the healthcare system, and caused a mass shutdown of non-essential businesses. The city forecasted that the city fund revenues would decline by $986 million in fiscal 2020, over $5.6 billion in 21, and around $3 billion in the out years. In May, without changing its economic assumptions, the city prudently reevaluated its revenue assumptions and further reduced its fiscal 2021 tax projections by over $1.5 billion. These assumptions became the basis of the fiscal 2021 adopted budget and the fiscal years 2021 to 24 financial plan. Relying on reserves, an additional agency savings plan, and federal aid, which offset some COVID-19 expenses, fiscal 2020 ended with a surplus of $3.8 billion. The surplus was used to prepay fiscal 2021 expenses and help reduce the significant revenue loss. To balance fiscal 2021, the city reduced its general reserve from $1 billion to the statutory minimum of $100 million, removed the entire $250 million capital stabilization reserve, and reduced the retiree health benefits trust by an additional $1.6 billion. After accounting for $368 million in agency new needs and city council program restorations, in addition to city council initiatives of $376 million, the city implemented an additional fiscal 2021 agency savings program that will produce over $1.5 billion in savings or additional revenues. The recurring savings in the out years amount to only $500 million in each succeeding year. After these and other assumptions, the city still had $1 billion deficit in fiscal 2021 that needs to be closed. The adopted budget assumes $1 billion in unspecified labor savings to be negotiated by October to close the gap. As the city has entered phase 4 of the state's reentry plan, with strict limitations on indoor activities, including indoor dining, it is very hard to project whether or not the city's assumption of non-property taxes, excluding audits, falling 14.3% in fiscal 2021 before rising 15.4% in fiscal 22, 6.6% in 23, and 2.8% in 24 is conservative enough. You can make an argument that we should wait and see what happens as the fiscal year unfolds. There are, however, several factors that may cause a shortfall in fiscal 2021 and less of a rebound in both 22 and 23. The uncertainty on how long restrictions on indoor activity will continue, whether or not the federal government will replace city and state revenue losses, will international tourism be restricted longer than calendar year 2020, and will the scarcity of commercial property transactions persist, makes it wise for the city to start planning how they will deal with further revenue losses. Just a small reduction in the city's growth rate assumptions could cause a risk of $500 million in fiscal 2021, $750 million in 22, and $1 billion in each of 23 and 24. On the expenditure side, in addition to the typical risk of higher uniform overtime spending that usually occurs each year, there are two specific areas of uncertainty that for the first time in many years increased our risk assessment significantly. The agency savings plan contains reductions of police overtime by $295 million and correction overtime by $66 million in fiscal 2021. The city has never shown it can control overtime by this magnitude. Without any detailed management plan that would change how overtime is authorized, it is unlikely these savings will be achieved. In addition, the unspecified labor savings of $1 billion in each year of the plan are at risk. Negotiations have just started, and we have no details on how these savings are expected to be achieved. The city has stated that if the negotiations are unsuccessful by October, layoffs will occur to achieve the required savings. If this is to be considered a viable backup, the city must develop a detailed plan on how and when the layoffs would occur. Layoffs at the magnitude proposed are not an easy task under the civil service law and cannot be achieved in a timely fashion without detailed advanced planning. Our total risk assessment would increase the budget gaps by $2 billion in fiscal 2021, $2.3 billion in 22, and about $2.7 billion in each of 23 and 24. The total gaps the city would have to close in the out years would be $6.5 billion in fiscal 2022, $5.7 billion in 23, and $5.9 billion in 24. Our risk assessment does not account for any additional state aid reductions which may occur if the state does not receive federal assistance. To help close the fiscal 2020 gap, the city still has some reserves available in the Retiree Health Benefits Trust, as well as the normal write-down of prior year payables and potential debt service savings due to low interest rates. In the out years, the city has wisely maintained the $1 billion general reserve and a $250 million capital stabilization reserve in each year. In addition, the city and state are still lobbying for federal assistance to offset the revenue losses caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The city cannot wait or count on this assistance. Plans need to be developed now to deal with the risks, not just in the current fiscal year, but more importantly, starting to deal with the growing out-year gaps. For many years, the city's strategy has been to build up large surpluses in the current fiscal year to help balance the next fiscal year. In fiscal 2021, without federal assistance, this strategy is unlikely to work. Therefore, the city must develop a multi-billion-dollar plan with recurring savings in order to deal with the very large fiscal 2022 projected budget deficit. Given the uncertainty of federal assistance and the possibility of further revenue declines, I would recommend that the board consider meeting after the first quarter modification is submitted to ensure the city is on the path to budget balance in fiscal 2021 and reducing the out-year budget gaps. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Director Summer.
Mr. Chairman, whenever you deem it appropriate, I'd love to respond to the last two presentations, whenever you see fit.
Do you want, Mr. Mayor, I was going to let the private members go, see if they have any comments, and then we'll go back to you. Is that work?
Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to ask the private members, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Thompson, do you have any comments?
I have no comments at this point.
Yeah,
Mr. Cohen?
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate everybody, and the detail has been enormously helpful. And I do recognize the extraordinary work and challenges facing both the mayor and the city and the state. The one thing that I am concerned about, I think it's been echoed by all these presentations, is that we're watching a crisis that isn't over, and things are unfolding as we speak, and as we try to get ahead of the difficulties that have already been imposed upon the city. I happen to agree with the mayor completely that the city will come back. And I think the city will be stronger and the city will be better. I think what we're dealing with, though, is a timing issue. And the problem with that timing issue is if we are wrong about when the city comes back, if we're wrong about when the recovery begins, I fear that the consequences to businesses, and especially small businesses, and to working New Yorkers who are confronting all sorts of problems not of their own making, will become worse, and it may end up leading to a recovery that they will never really benefit from. You know, one of the things that I've been involved in the last 6 months has been focusing on the restart. And the restart, I think, has been managed exceedingly well as I think it could have occurred. And the results are obvious given where New York is, both in terms, or largely in terms of the health metrics that exist today. And by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our chairman for his role in all of that. But you see that there are so many New Yorkers who are who are suffering and will continue to suffer. And I just do worry that keeping an eye on the timing of that recovery, and making sure, given what is going on in Washington today, and what may befall us come November, will have consequences that are beyond our control and for which it is difficult to plan today. So I think I am not the only person, and I appreciate the recommendation from the staff that I think we need to keep a careful eye on what is about to unfold and what we're all living through.
Thank you. Just go to the Secretary of State. Do you have any comments or questions?
Thank you. I have no comments at this time.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Rosanna. Mr. Mayor, would you like to respond to the comments from the board members?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to pick up on, I'm going to go in reverse order from the last comments. Mr. Cohen's point, first, do want to note the fact that the city is now the place that people around the country are looking to, and the state as well, obviously. Do want to give you credit, Mr. Chairman. You've been a crucial part of that, and our teams have been really working constantly and well together with very much the same strategies. We should, while we're talking about very, very real challenges that we have to prepare for, we should be proud of the fact that we've shown our mettle as a city, as a state, and now sustain these much lower infection rates, because that is really the key to everything. Everything, the very good, real comments everyone's made, everything hinges on the healthcare situation. We get the healthcare situation right, all things are possible. We don't get that right, then the dire concerns and real concerns here become even worse. So I think we've all put the horse before the cart. I want to thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. And I think to Mr. Cohen's point about timing, I agree with him entirely. No one's resting on laurels, certainly in New York City. We are not assuming, I want to say this collegially because it's such a good point. No one is sitting around assuming the rosiest picture. We've just spent 5 months in warfare here dealing with unimaginable challenges. And every one of us who went through March and April, we could barely believe how quickly things moved, and it looked like it was going to get a lot worse, and we were ready to deal with much, much worse circumstances. So I say that to say we are all sort of forged in battle here to assume any number of possibilities. And we do not think the timing is going to be easy and convenient, even though I share Mr. Cohen's optimism. No, the pieces may fit better or worse at any given point. We have to be ready for each. And from the city point of view, we'll make the tough choices. I mean, this is what I certainly signed up for. I didn't expect a pandemic, but I know I will have to make a series of choices, and if they get tougher, they get tougher. I'm certainly ready for that. Now, to Mr. Summers' point, I think it's fair to say we have to, it is the biggest article of faith to me that we know nothing about the stimulus yet. I want to affirm that point. I have told my colleagues there could be no stimulus. There could be a stimulus that has very little impact on New York City and New York State, the way it is written. Or there could be a decent stimulus that helps us tide over. Or there could be a fair stimulus and a just stimulus, such as the House of Representatives passed. But I don't think we should think of this at one bite at the apple, because I'm not reading tea leaves or assuming anything here, but we have one opportunity now with the ongoing conversations in Washington. I think it's objectively true to say there may be a very different opportunity in January, February next year. We may have the same partisan alignment in the White House, in the US Senate. We may have one different, another different, both different. We don't know. But it is certainly conceivable that we will have a different reality as soon as January 20. Which in terms of everything we're talking about getting through fiscal year 21 is a very pertinent part of the equation. So uniting Mr. Cohen's point and Mr. Summers' point, I'm not sitting here assuming a thing, but I do want us to at least keep in mind how soon we may be dealing with a very different reality, and one that I think would be fair to say there's several scenarios where the respect for the needs in New York State and New York City could increase in very material ways. I further want to say that we have been seeing something interesting and promising, and it's not something we're taking to the bank, but it is important. As we took moves to help encourage economic activity, we see people responding. I do think there's a tremendous amount of pent-up economic demand in New York City. I think there's a lot of money that would have flowed outside the city that right now is being used in the city. I think the example with outdoor dining, it's one small piece of a puzzle, but it's a very interesting one. We now project that about 80,000 jobs have been restored through the outdoor dining initiative, and it continues to grow. I say that because that's money that New Yorkers are spending now, who do have the money to spend, who might have spent it out of town on a normal summer. Also crucial to remember, as many challenges as we face, unlike some cities in this country or some states, we have a very, very diverse economy. So we have a large number of New Yorkers who continue to work and are working from home, who, because of the nature of their jobs, tech, finance industry, many others, have been able to maintain their employment. We have a lot of companies that continue to do well. I don't have to tell anyone on this gathering that the finance sector is doing very well. So we are not in a black and white situation here. There are vibrant parts of our economy still creating wealth for people that's being spent in New York City, and that's something we need to harness in a very positive way. On the point about recurring savings Mr. Sommer raised, we are absolutely focused on that reality, and that is about the structural changes we want to make, continued deepening of healthcare savings. The labor issue, your point about timing, well taken, Mr. Sommer. In fact, agencies are about to be instructed in the matter of the next few days about their exact savings target, and that will be extrapolated into what the number of layoffs will be. They are being timed so they can be actualized for October 1st, and our team, First Deputy Mayor Houlihan and Budget Director Hartzog, will certainly brief you or anyone else who needs it on that timeline, because you're right, there are complexities, but we will match the requirements needed. Again, I am hopeful, and I believe we've had tremendous cooperation with the vast majority of labor unions throughout our administration. I think we will have it again. I think everyone's looking for solutions and speaking collegially. We did find great healthcare savings in the past through a responsible cooperative process. I believe we're going to find a number of options here well in advance of October 1st. But if for any reason that proves not to be true, we will have the ability technically and the will to move forward layoffs, as much as I do not want to see that happen by definition. Finally, on the city controller's comments, want to start with some very powerful common ground. I appreciate deeply the city controller's strong embrace of the notion of asking those who have done very well to contribute a little more in this time of crisis. I don't think anyone here has missed what's happened in the stock market. While everyday working people are suffering, while hundreds of thousands of people lost their job, the stock market continues to do very well. Those who are rich have literally become richer. And it is right to ask of them help and sacrifice in this moment. So I do hope that there'll be a focus in Albany on greater taxation of the wealthy, even for a limited period of time, to help us through this crisis. And I thank the city controller for sharing that view. Also want to affirm his point that we are not looking to build back as we were before. We are looking to come back while simultaneously addressing inequities and disparities. We do not want to repeat of what we had before. We won't allow it. In fact, what I've found, and this is part of why we did use the revenue we had to make investments, to increase our city workforce. I will defend to anyone why the investment in pre-K and 3K was worth every single dollar. And that disproportionately helped communities of color and working class and low income people and their children, and took an economic burden off of them. I will defend anytime, anywhere, the investments we made in public health to strengthen our healthcare system, health and hospitals. We did not know a pandemic was coming. But in fact, to the controller's point, we have had a strategy of redistribution, which now amounts to tens of billions of dollars being moved from those who were doing better to working people, to communities of color, to our public workforce. And I think it has worked, and it was working as recently as February on an unprecedented level. I believe it was the right thing to do. Now we will adjust intensely for the reality before us. To the controller's point, I don't want there to be a misunderstanding about our history on savings or our devotion to further savings. And I want to give Melanie Hartzog a lot of credit here. Constant focus on savings. Yeah, I'm certain some savings historically, including in our time, has been one shot. There's also a lot of savings that has been recurring and structural and more to come, because what OMB has proven under the leadership of Melanie Hartzog is the ability to constantly find the next efficiency and the next saving, including those things you pointed to rightfully, Mr. Comptroller, the small things, the nagging things that should have been dealt with a long time ago. Those all are in our sights, but much bigger things as well, and they must be recurring. And to Mr. Summers' point, the labor savings will be recurring. Unfortunately, the word layoff comes with a lot of finality. That is not just a fiscal 21 savings. That is a fiscal 22 and thereafter savings as well, until such time as the situation changes. So unquestionably, we take seriously the need for recurrent savings. I would argue that previous investments were all about hastening and deepening economic growth, which actually brought us back a lot of revenue because New York City was doing so well, it kept increasing our revenue position. But we're in a very, very different time now. And we will constantly demand more and more of our agencies. Some savings, it's true, were conditional upon the coronavirus crisis, but I don't think anyone here doubts that if we couldn't have kids in school or couldn't mount summer youth programs because it was physically impossible under the health conditions we knew at the time, that was an appropriate savings. But no one mistakes that for the same thing as the kind of savings that we need that need to be more constant. So I think although there's always going to be differences of interpretation, I think there's actually a lot of unity on the underlying points. The last point I want to make, Mr. Chairman, on the borrowing, I would argue to you that the central thrust here has been to say New York City managed to create its strongest economy ever, and with a workforce that was providing exceptional service to the people of the city. Our teachers, our first responders, our healthcare heroes, I don't have any complaint about what they've been achieving. The facts are there. Till all this hit, the city was getting safer, our kids were getting better educated, our healthcare system was strengthening. I'll defend any of those investments. When we went to Albany for borrowing some weeks ago, it was with the explicit need to not have to turn to layoffs, to not undercut all that progress, but more importantly, to not lose the chance for recovery. It was articulated to leadership in the legislature that our goal was to keep our public workforce strong so we could provide the services that would undergird economic recovery. We'll continue to work with people on the visions that they need to buy into and hear. That's very appropriate. We want transparency. We think we can do that together. But I am a big believer that a strong public workforce that provides strong services actually is prerequisite to economic recovery. It's an argument I've made to the House and Senate in Washington, and I certainly make it to Albany as well. So we look forward to working with everyone to figure out what that balance point is that will bring a sense of a common purpose. But I assure you, if we have to move forward with layoffs, we will. Do I think that will hasten economic recovery? I do not. I think it's the other way around. I think we should all be working together to figure out how to keep this engine of New York City rebuilding every single day. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I just want to point out that I think we have our mutual goal here. Number one priority is try to get as much federal assistance from Washington to both the city and the state, because we're here for a reason that is not anything that New York City or New York State created. It's a national crisis. And right now they're discussing that bill, and that's our number one priority. Once we know what the federal government provides for New York City, New York State, or doesn't, then it's on, we'll have to review long-term plans. And I think that is the point I think other board members have made. The key here is what are the pieces of a long-term plan? And in the absence of knowing how this pandemic is going to end, right, how long that's going to take, I think that is part of the missing piece. We'll know for how we're going to balance the budgets over the long term, whether it's a 1-year problem, a 2-year problem, right, a 3-year problem, or a 4-year, or the 4-year problem. So That's, I think, is if I'm hearing all of the board members correctly, seem to be revolving around the issue of just making sure we have a sustainable plan over the long term. We agree, and let's focus on Washington right now. With that, I'm going to call on Executive Director Summer to report on the staff's recommendations for fiscal year 2020 and the recommendations concerning the proposed resolution on the city's finances.
Thank you, Chairman. We review each year the 5 conditions that prior to 2008, if they had occurred, would have reimposed an automatic control period. Now we review them with the idea of, does the board recommend asking the state legislature to reimpose the control period or not? The 5 conditions are: 1, the city shall have incurred a deficit in excess of $100 million in the results of operation. The city has ended fiscal 2020 subject to the final audit with a surplus of $3.8 billion and has prepaid fiscal 2021 expenses. 2, 3, and 4 are: the city shall have failed to pay principal or interest on any of its notes or bonds when due and payable. The city shall have issued notes in violation of the restrictions on short-term borrowing set forth Section 9B of the Act. And the controllers, and I'll make this more simple than normal, the controllers need to certify that there is sufficient market access to meet the city's needs. The city has paid all principal and interest on its notes and bonds and has not violated any of the short-term borrowing provisions of the FEA. I have also received letters from the state and city controllers informing me that they do not see any likelihood that they would have reason to issue a joint certification relating to market access. 5, the city shall have violated any provisions of the Act, and such violation substantially impairs the ability of the city to pay principal or interest on its bonds or notes when due and payable, or the city's ability to adopt or adhere to a balanced operating budget. The city has not violated any provisions of the Act. The staff therefore recommends that the board approve a resolution determining that as of August 6, 2020, none of the events which would have required the imposition of the control period has occurred, nor is there a substantial likelihood and imminence of such occurrence, and that the city, while experiencing fiscal stress due to the pandemic, at this time, it does not jeopardize the orderly functioning of the city's fiscal affairs.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions or comments on the staff recommendation as presented by Director Summers? Okay. Hearing no comments, I will now entertain a motion to approve the determination. Is there a second? Thank you, Controller DiNapoli. Now make a motion to approve the determination. All in favor?
Aye.
The motion is approved. So I think we're done with the meeting. There's no further business before us. I would now entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Thank you. All right, with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.